Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Starr, and I am with the Standlee Premium Western Forage Marketing Team. At Standlee, we believe in putting the health and well-being of all livestock and animals first by delivering the best nutrition and comfort through the highest quality forage. Simply put, give them the best so they feel their best. And nutritional education is the key to understanding our animals better and providing that desired comfort and care. So on that note, we are very excited to offer this educational webinar titled A Window into My Horse's Digestive System, How It Works and How It Can Fail. Understanding the basics of the digestive system can set us up for success when feeding our horses. So we're really looking forward to sharing this great information with you all. First, if you're new to joining our webinars, we'll take just a minute to go over a few items so you are comfortable with viewing and participating in our webinar tonight. As a heads up, we will have a couple of poll questions throughout the webinar that we will pause the presentation for you to answer. We will also be giving away some free product coupons at the end of the webinar, so you're definitely going to want to stay with us till the end. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the Attendee Interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. Clicking on the red box with the white arrow allows you to open and close the control panel anytime you'd like during the presentation. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default, and if you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed there for you. You will also have an opportunity to submit via text to today's presenter some questions, and you can type those questions into the questions pane of the control panel. Please feel free to send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll go ahead and collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Just depending on how many questions that come in throughout the presentation, we may not be able to address all of them within our time frame, but we will certainly use them for future nutritional pieces and connect with you one-on-one if you reach out to us. We've also attached 3 nutritional papers associated with today's webinar that you can download from the control panel under handouts. And for those that end up viewing this as a recording, go to StanleyForage.com under Nutrition and Nutritional Resources to find the handouts that are titled Dietary Changes and Forage, Forage for Horses, the Key to Health, and Hey, have you thought about your horse's forage? These are all great handouts that encompass today's topic for more information. And that's all I have from an introductory standpoint. So please help me welcome Dr. Tania Cubitt with Performance Horse Nutrition, who serves as one of our Standlee Premium Western Forage equine nutritionists. She has a PhD in equine nutrition and reproduction. And with that, I will go ahead and let Dr. Cubitt tell you just a little bit more about herself before she begins the presentation.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. As Katie said, just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Australia. I moved over here in 2001 and did a master's and PhD at Virginia Tech in equine nutrition and growth, and then in reproduction for my PhD. And now I work with a company called Performance Horse Nutrition, and we are an international equine consulting group. We work with lots of different companies all around the world. And we're fortunate to work with Standlee Premium Western Forage because for us, education is really the key to success when we deal with our horse owners and clients. But the other part of it is that forage and good quality forage is the most important part of any horse's diet. So we're really proud of the fact that we partner with Standlee Premium Western Forage. So with that, we'll get started. I know sometimes people can look at a topic and think, well, that's a bit vague, or maybe that's a little bit basic. I'd like to learn about something that's a little bit more complex. But really, if we look at what we're going to talk about tonight, we'll talk about the evolution of the horse, a little bit about anatomy and function, and then how, based on what we know how the digestive system is supposed to work, we will then also look at how it fails. And we'll look at nutrient absorption as well, because I think sometimes people are curious as to where do particular nutrients get absorbed. And I know some of these may seem a little basic to you, but it's absolutely critical that we understand the basics of the horse's overall digestive system, because then it makes you better able to answer questions about your horse. Oops. So if we look here at the evolution of the horse, very basic. The picture on the left-hand side of the slide, it's got a group of horses in what looks like a really weedy open space. That's not necessarily a weedy field. That's a field with a wide variety of different forage types. Horses eat a wide variety of forages in the wild. They live in herds. They eat off the ground. They continuously graze, and they move while they eat. What we do with horses is pretty foreign. We stick them in a stall with no other horses around, and we make them eat at chest height, and we meal feed them, which is completely foreign. On the right-hand side, I know that picture looks ideal, but that's not necessarily great for the horse either. We've got one type of forage out there, a horse by itself. Yes, it's eating off the ground, so at least that's good. But in our modern horse diet, we consume a lot more cereal grain-based diets because we expect horses to live longer, exercise harder, have babies every year. So their energy requirements are much higher than those in the wild. They consume these cereal grain-based diets really quickly. That increases the overall acidity of the GI tract. Now, as we go through the anatomy of the digestive system, you will notice that some areas are supposed to be quite acidic, but what happens if we get too much acidity in areas that it shouldn't be? So we'll look now at basics of the anatomy and function of the digestive system. The teeth are the first part of the horse's digestive system, and you know when you chew, we chew in an up and down. If you put your hands together like a crocodile mouth, you'll chew up and down. But the horse, its bottom jaw is hinged just below the horse's ears, and that bottom jaw actually moves in a circular motion, side to side. And if your horse has long teeth or there are gaps, then chewing, the teeth won't line up and we won't have good chewing surfaces. Also, when the horse chews correctly, when that bottom jaw aligns to the top jaw, is actually when the horse puts its head down on the ground. Some signs that your horse may not have the best teeth, or there may be something going wrong that you need to investigate. If he tends to chew with his head sideways, or he drops his feed, refusing the feed, or losing weight, it's very, very important to investigate at that point. So this is an interesting slide. The other thing that happens when you chew food is you produce saliva, and saliva is very important. It lubricates the esophagus, so it helps food pass down the throat and into the stomach. It also is very basic. That means it buffers the stomach acid. There's research being done where we can actually put these little contraptions called bite meters on a halter and put it on the horse while it's chewing different types of food and put in different positions, and we can then measure how many bites it's taken to consume that quantity of food. So if we look at the table there, we've got 2 pounds of oats put in a tub on the ground, 2 pounds of hay in a tub on the ground, or 2 pounds of sweet feed at chest height, hanging in a bucket at chest height. And you can see when the horse consumes 2 pounds of oats from a tub on the floor, it chews about 1,000 times to consume all of that food. When it's hay on the ground, double the amount of chew. So that's double the amount of saliva that's going into the stomach and buffering that acid. And 2,000 chews is going to take considerably longer, so slowing down the rate of intake. That's more mimicking that natural grazing behavior. 2 pounds of sweet feed at chest height over halves the amount of time, 350 to 500 chews to get that food consumed. So it's very, very quick. So just by putting the feed on the ground, we can slow down the rate of intake and therefore slow down the horse's risk for choke. Horses don't choke on a particular ingredient, they choke because of the way they're eating the food. And it's horses that eat quickly have a higher likelihood of choking. So then if we move to the esophagus, it's a long muscular tube that goes from the mouth all the way to the stomach. Our esophagus is also our windpipe. So if I choke on some food, I also can't breathe. If the horse is choking on some food, his windpipe is separate, so he can still breathe, but you'll notice them straining. They'll be coughing a lot to try and dislodge whatever's stuck, and then they can actually inhale it and aspirate it, and it'll go down into the lungs and then can cause a secondary pneumonia. If we move then to the stomach, and you'll see this graphic in green several times over the next few slides, and I'll have the organ that we're talking about highlighted. In this case, we're talking about the stomach, and it's highlighted there in pink. In relation to the rest of the digestive system, the squiggly thing being the small intestine and the big fluffy cloud-like thing being the hindgut, made up of 3 different sections, the stomach is tiny. Why? Because the horse was never designed to eat large meals. He was always designed to have a small amount of nutrients constantly trickling through the digestive system. Meal feeding, as I've mentioned, is one of the most foreign things that we do with horses. If I was showing you a diagram of a lion's digestive system, they have a very large stomach because they don't know when their next meal is coming and they need to gorge on whatever they're eating. Horses, though, are designed anatomically to continue grazing small amounts of food. So if you put any more than 3 to 4 pounds of concentrate or that cereal grain, it's going to flow through the stomach very quickly. Now, if I cut a window in the stomach and I show you it, there's a photograph there on the right-hand side. You can see the dark pink tissue at the bottom. We call that the protected region, protected by the slippery, slimy mucus coating. You can see a bit of that mucus right there. And up in the top area here, there's light pink tissue. We call that the non-protected region. Now, what is it protected from? It's protected from acid. There are tiny little cells down in that dark pink area that secrete acid. Based on the anatomy of the horse and how I have said the horse is designed to continually consume food, it should make sense to you then that those little cells continually secrete acid. Unlike the lion, where he doesn't know when his next meal is coming, and those cells actually secrete acid as a meal response, the horse continually secretes acid. Excuse me. So that leads us to this graph, which is quite astounding, that close to 90% of performance horses have gastric ulcers, over 60% have colonic ulcers, so in the hindgut, and over half the population have them in both areas of the GI tract. Now, we'll talk more about colonic ulcers when we go through the anatomy of the colon, but that's a really, really important, that nearly 90% of performance horses have gastric ulcers. So what's causing it? Well, we're feeding a lot more cereal grain-based diets. We're meal feeding or intermittent feeding. Horses don't have access to something to chew on, some kind of forage, for at least 17 hours out of the day. Horses in the wild would graze about 17 hours a day, which would ensure that there was, for 24 hours, for every hour of the day, there was something sitting in their GI tract, in their stomach. So this increased acidity, this intermittent feeding, transporting horses is extremely stressful, as is exercising for that matter. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like bute will also wear away at that mucus coating. This is a really neat graph, I think, and graphic. So the dark line in the graph on the top left-hand corner of your slide is showing the pressure on the stomach when the horse is exercising. And you can see as he's walking, trotting, cantering, or doing hill work, that pressure increases. So the pictures on the bottom are the stomach and the liquid or the acid in that stomach. And down the bottom in that light pink liquid, that's really strong, like lemon juice. And as you move up, it gets to be weaker and weaker, almost like water. Well, what happens when we exercise that horse is we push that liquid, strong liquid, up and up and up into that non-protected region where there's no protective coating, and we see a lot of gastric ulcers. Limiting forage, not giving them enough forage, as quick as 24 hours to 48 hours, we're seeing quite severe ulceration. And at 4 days of not enough forage, we're seeing very significant ulcers being formed. You'll notice poor appetite, poor body condition. Behavioral changes is really one of the first things you notice, and that all, of course, leads to a decrease in performance, and also mild to moderate colic symptoms depending on how bad. So I'll turn it over to Katie now for our first poll question.
Thanks, Dr. Cubit. So our first polling question: what is the best feed or forage for minimizing ulcers? And the options to choose from are Timothy grass, oats, alfalfa, and corn. So please just go ahead and select the most appropriate response and click submit. Don't worry if you're a little unsure of the answer, just provide your best guess. Your specific answer won't be seen by any of the other attendees, but we will view the total responses together once the poll is closed. All right, it looks like most of you have voted. If you could just get your final votes in there, we'll go ahead and close the poll shortly. Perfect. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close it now. And I'm going to share the responses. So, Dr. Cubit, we have 74% say Timothy grass, 26% say alfalfa, and we have 0% for both oats and corn.
Excellent. Okay, so actually, whilst we could make a case for the Timothy, making sure that the horse had something in front of him all the time to chew on, create saliva, etc., the research that was done at Texas A&M University looked at feeding alfalfa versus a coastal Bermuda grass hay. Alfalfa is very high in calcium. If we take ourselves all the way back to high school chemistry, calcium is basic versus acid, so you put the two together and you can neutralize that acid. So alfalfa, with its high calcium content, actually acts to buffer that stomach acid. So just by feeding alfalfa to these horses that had severe ulcers, that was effective at reducing the incidence of gastric ulcers, more effective than just grass hay. That being said, I also like to make sure that I'm giving the horses something to chew on throughout the day, making sure that they've got plenty of access, constant access for something to chew on. If you've got an overweight horse and you worry about giving them too much hay for them to get fat, that's where we employ slow feeders, that kind of thing. So now we'll move on to the small intestine. I've got it highlighted in here in red. It's a big long squiggly thing. If I laid it out on the ground, it looks like a garden hose. There's no acid per se or bacteria here that break down food. There are enzymes. There is a particular enzyme in the small intestine called amylase, and it's responsible for breaking down starch. There's only a certain amount of amylase. So another reason why we know we can't feed large grain meals: reason one, stomach is very small. Reason two, there's only a certain amount of amylase, and amylase is breaking down the starch. So if we feed too large of a grain meal, that amylase will be used up, and there'll still be cereal grains or starches that have not been digested that will flow through to the large intestine of the horse. Also, the concept of feeding whole grains to horses. Horses really aren't designed to eat grains to start with. So the only grain that is safe to feed the horses unprocessed is oats. The digestibility difference between whole oats and crimped oats is only about 3%. But if we're looking at other grains like corn or barley, you absolutely must process them. The horse cannot digest them properly in the small intestine. They will flow to the large intestine, and it will be disaster will strike. So then we move to the beginning of what I consider the hindgut. We call this the cecum. It's a blind sac, meaning its entry and exit point are at the same place on the top of that structure. It's full of bacteria that make acid, utilize acid. If those bacteria get out of balance, first thing they will create is gas. Being that the entry and exit point are at the same place, it's very easy for this to fill with gas or there to be some impactions here. If we move then to the large colon, I've got it highlighted in blue here. It's got twists and turns, and it's in those twists and turns that impaction can occur. Everybody's probably stuck their hand in a bale of hay that was baled slightly damp and know that it's very, very hot. The exact same principle occurs in the large colon of the horse. As the bacteria are breaking down or fermenting that fiber, they create heat. So that heat is great for keeping your horse warm in the wintertime. Not so great if you're riding your horse in the middle of summer and you live in California or Florida where it's very hot. So in those areas of the country and when it's very, very hot, or if you have a horse that suffers from the non-sweating disorders like anhidrosis, you want to make sure that you're feeding very, very digestible sources of fiber like beet pulp. If you want to keep your horse really warm, it can be a little stemmier type hay. In the small colon, what we're doing is we're now sucking all of the moisture out of the non-digestible material that's left over, and this is where we form fecal balls. So if your horse has some loose manure or diarrhea, something may be occurring here in the lining of the small colon that we're not able to absorb that water. Which leads us to water. It's absolutely critical. In cooler weather, a 1,000, 1,100-pound horse will drink around 10 to 12 gallons of water. In hot weather, it's double that. And if your horse is lactating or it's sweating a lot, then we increase even further. Now, I think this is an interesting little tidbit that a horse will consume about a quarter to a half a gallon of water for every pound of hay that they eat. So if you're struggling to get your horse to drink water, other than adding salt to the horse's diet, you can also just make sure they're getting more fiber. If a horse is a little dehydrated, the very first thing I ask is how much fiber are they getting in their diet. So we go back to that graph that we saw before where we saw a 90% having gastric ulcers, which we've talked about, but 60% have colonic ulcers. Now, any of you in the audience that are listening in that have a horse with stomach ulcers knows how painful that horse can be. You saw the stomach is extremely small in relation to the colon. Now let's put those sores all through the colon, and it becomes very evident that whilst colonic ulcers are less frequent, they can be very much more severe. More colic-like symptoms, diarrhea. If your horse has diarrhea, they're dehydrated because they're not absorbing that water. The large colon, the small colon, the cecum absorbs a lot of nutrition. So if that tissue is damaged, it's not going to be absorbing that nutrition. Some of the things that we recommend: pelleted or cubed forage for about 2 to 4 weeks after diagnosis or suspicion of colonic ulcers, just to give that tissue time to heal. Dr. Frank Andrews, who's probably one of the world's leading experts on all things ulcers, also recommends live cell yeast extract to help stabilize the hindgut pH. So we'll use alfalfa for the stomach to help stabilize that pH or acidity, but we want to use live cell yeast culture to stabilize hindgut pH. And anytime that you can replace the calories in the diet that are being provided from sugars and starches and cereal grains with better quality forages and a fat supplement, that's also ideal. There are 1,001 different types of colics. Probably the two most common are impaction colic, which we see in those twists and turns there in the large colon. I see it the most with weather shifts. So we go from the summer or the fall into the fall, where we've changed, it's got a little cooler, horses are drinking a little less, they're eating more hay because they're in more, not out on pasture as much, and pasture has a lot of moisture in it. So we get this shift in the moisture content in the GI tract, and we see impaction colic a lot. Gas colic, as I mentioned, there are hundreds of thousands of different type of microbes in the large intestine, the colon of the horse. And it takes time for those bacteria to adjust to new feedstuffs. So if you make a feeding change too quickly, or the horse gets into some excess grain or eats toxic weed, and we have those bacterial populations get out of balance, the first thing they do is secrete excess gas. That leads us to the next poll question, and I'll hand it over to Katie.
Thanks, Dr. Cubit. Our second polling question is, when not on pasture, what do you feed your horse first? So in order of the feed or forage that you end up feeding them. The options are grain, forage, I do not feed grain, I do not feed forage, or my horse is always on pasture. Just go ahead and select the most appropriate response and click submit. Okay, most of you have voted now. If you could just complete your votes, we will close. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and close the polls now. So Dr. Cubit, what we have first, the highest one, 69% say they feed forage first. And then the next one, 18% say my horse is always on pasture, followed by 7% I do not feed grain, and then 5% they feed grain first, and 0% I do not feed forage.
Okay, well, excellent that we had 0% of people say they don't feed forage to horses. And really, some of the research suggests that feeding a forage first when you're stabling your horse before feeding the grain can slow down rate of intake. And I've done a few small studies where we fed horses hay first, and it did definitely slow down how quickly they consumed their feed and changed their behavior. But as long as you're feeding forage, that's excellent. Which leads me to most horses. We had a large portion actually saying their horses are always out at pasture, but really a very large population of the horse group now in America really don't have access to pasture all the time. So they're 100% reliant on their owners or the barn managers for their fiber requirements. And so what does that mean? Absolute bare minimum would be 1% of body weight. This is also very important, even if you do have access to pasture in the winter months, if you take your horses off pasture to save the fields or it gets too cold. So 1% of body weight will just keep the gut functioning. The horse will lose weight and he probably won't be that healthy. That'll be about 10 pounds of hay or forage for that 1,000-pound horse. If I want to put a horse on a weight loss program, I'm going to have him at about 1.2% of body weight, so about 12 pounds of forage. My more general recommendation is between 1.5% and 2.5% of body weight, so that'd be about 15 to 25 pounds of hay for that 1,000-pound horse. What will happen if you don't give enough forage? Well, we've looked at the gastric ulcers, the hindgut ulcers, because we get this hindgut acidic environment, colic. But then also the stereotypic behaviors, that cribbing, wood chewing, behavioral issues like weaving and aggression. Now, a lot of those cribbing and wood chewing begin maybe because they've got a discomfort or they're craving some non-digestible fiber. But you may have a horse and everything's perfect. He has plenty of hay, he has plenty of pasture. So why on earth is he doing it? Sometimes it's a learned behavior. Maybe at some point in his life before you got him, he was uncomfortable and he learned that behavior. And it's very hard to break them of it. I actually was speaking with a client the other day, and it's the springtime. Most of the country, the weather has been, we've had a very early spring, and we've had a lot of great lush spring grass. And she said, why on earth are my horses all of a sudden now just chewing wood? And it's really they're craving some non-digestible fiber. So if you start to see your horses chew wood and you feel like you're giving them plenty of pasture, just throw out a little stemmier hay, maybe some first cut hay. So where are nutrients absorbed? This is very brief. Protein, 60 to 70% absorbed in the small intestine, about 30 to 40% in the hindgut. Soluble carbohydrates, your sugars and starches, 65 to 75% in the small intestine, a very small amount designed to be digested in the hindgut of the horse. Fiber, 75 to 85% in the hindgut of the horse. Fats, no specific percentages, but we say primarily the small intestine. Makes sense. Fiber, which is digested in the hindgut, is typically about 3% or less in fats. Calcium, magnesium, around 95 to 99% in the small intestine. Phosphorus, primarily in the hindgut of the horse. And vitamins are really a mix between the two. So really the take-home message. Fiber from pasture or hay or hay products, being your pelleted products or cubed products, is absolutely critical for a healthy digestive system. Horses are anatomically designed to digest and utilize fiber. They're not designed to utilize large quantities of grain. 65% of the digestive system of the horse is dedicated to fiber digestion. So I hope that by me showing you the digestive system, it really hits home why fiber is absolutely so critical. We may have changed what we do with horses, we've changed how we manage horses, but they have not evolved. Their digestive system has not evolved to that style of management. So I appreciate you listening in.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Cubit, for some great insight into the horse's digestive system. Just remember to download the 3 nutritional papers under handouts before we end this evening's webinar. We will be drawing our winner for free product coupons following this Q&A session, so go ahead and stick around for that. Let's go ahead and get started on just a few questions that were submitted during today's presentation. Again, please feel free to still continue to submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel if you'd like, and we'll go ahead and get to those. So the first question that we have is from Jessica, and her question is, and you alluded to this just a little bit, but how can hay quality, finer grass blades versus coarser blades affect a horse's GI tract, especially as horses age?
Great question, and it's really not necessarily about blade width. That's more a function of the variety of hay. Some species of grass have wider blades versus others. It's more about the actual fiber analysis, the acid detergent fiber and the neutral detergent fiber, and they are measures of palatability and digestibility. And, you know, we didn't really have a lot of time to talk about pasture or grass or plant anatomy, but you think about as a plant matures, it gets taller and taller and taller, and something's got to hold it upright. And what holds it upright are those structural carbohydrates or the fiber. So as a plant gets older and older and older, it gets more of that structural carbohydrate or fiber, and that fiber gets the more and more and more that builds up, the less digestible that plant is. So to me, it's a little more about the maturity of the plant. And with older horses, it's more about their ability to chew, break down, and their digestive capacity really does just slow down and decrease a little. So we want to make sure with older horses that we're feeding horses that have higher forages that have higher palatability and digestibility. So that is looking for hay sources that aren't necessarily your first cutting hay. First cutting hay, it takes us a little while to get out in the field because maybe it's rained, and those plants are a little more mature when we first cut them, and that's really the difference between your first cut and second cut. But it's not necessarily about the blade width. I hope that answered your question.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Cubit. Another question that we have come in is from Rhonda, and her question, I soak the forage cubes in water. Is that preferred?
Soaking forage cubes in water, I always recommend it because I always like to get more moisture into the horse's system. It also slows down rate of intake, and so anytime that we've got horses in stalls and we're feeding them a cube or a pellet, they can consume it a lot quicker than a long stem hay. So by adding water, it'll turn more into a mush, and it'll take a lot longer for them to consume it, therefore mimicking the grazing behavior. So whilst I wouldn't say that it's absolute necessity every single time, I always like to recommend it for a majority of different reasons.
Perfect. And Stephanie would like to know, alfalfa appears better for both ulcer prevention and low carbs, but I understand it also predisposes horses to stones and earless.
And that's a great question. I was just in California a couple of weeks ago, and I know that's a big problem out there. And really, enteroliths are a mineral buildup in the GI tract. It's a buildup around a stick or a stone or a piece of twine. The main thing that I recommend, because that mineral doesn't always just come from alfalfa. Yes, alfalfa has high calcium. That mineral can come from water content, if your water has a high mineral content. So I make sure that horses are drinking plenty of water. It's an area, if I know enteroliths are common in that area, I will often recommend putting salt on the feed, about a tablespoon a day, just to make sure that they're drinking plenty of water. But if I'm a little concerned, I might do a mix of alfalfa grass, but I'm not concerned about 100% removing alfalfa.
All right, and Jessica would like to know, what about the horses that are sensitive to certain kinds of hay? For example, a horse who has ulcers and sensitive to alfalfa hay.
As far as having a diagnosed allergy to alfalfa hay, and if you talk to any of the veterinarians that are allergy specialists, it's actually the kind of positive testing, the allergy testing is very poor and really does not show a lot of true positives. But in that case, then other management, adding a supplement that my concern for long-term maintenance, if you're feeding GastroGuard or UlcerGuard, your true ulcer medications, they're designed for about 30 days, and they really shouldn't be fed for long term. So utilizing other management practices, like making sure the horse has some kind of forage in front of them all the time so that they can constantly chew on it and mimic that grazing behavior. Not feeding them a lot of grain. If we're looking for body weight maintenance, making sure that we're adding fat supplements to the diet, doing those kinds of things. Adding a foregut and hindgut health supplement that has some calcium in it. That would be the route that I would go if we know there's a true aversion to alfalfa.
Great, thank you, Dr. Cubit. Bonnie would like to know, why are there so many horses with metabolic disorders such as Cushing's and insulin resistance?
Let's separate the two, and I would say Cushing's is in people, in dogs, as cats. It's typically an older animal disease, and horses are living a lot longer, and so we're seeing a much higher prevalence of it, and we're now able to diagnose it. If we separate that out from insulin resistance, human intervention. Metabolic disorders in horses are 100% human intervention. We have the majority of horses being overweight, eating very high sugar diets, high sugar pastures, not exercising a lot, genetic predispositions. In the wild, there's no metabolic syndrome. There's nothing like that, because also in the wild, weight fluctuations are very common. So if you think about pasture grass in the wild, spring pasture grass occurs in the wild as well, where we have this influx in sugars in the grass. But in the wintertime, horses lose a little bit of weight. Then the spring grass comes on, and they're able to eat that, gain a little weight, so that we're ready to go into the summer, where maybe the forage tapers off a little bit again and then picks up in the fall, preparing you for the winter. We've completely taken away that environmental weight fluctuation. We have genotypes of horses that we've taken away from their natural environment. Ponies, for example, that were adapted to very, very harsh conditions, harsh weather, harsh climates, and really ate sparse different types of forbs and grasses, and now we give them, an abundance of food. We have developed pasture grasses that we want to look out in a field, and we don't want dirt patches. Native grasses are what we call clumping. So if an animal wraps its teeth around it, or its tongue if it's a cow, it'll just rip that plant right out. Well, in the wild, that didn't matter, because it'd be 2-3 months before they might come back to that area and graze again. But we stick our horses in small areas, if they're grazing at all, And so we needed to make, agronomists have developed grasses that withstand the pressures of grazing, trampling, and weather fluctuations. And what makes anything stronger? Its ability to accumulate and store and utilize energy. What is energy in a grass? It's sugar. So the increased incidence of metabolic syndrome in horses is 100% human intervention.
Perfect, thank you. And it looks like we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So Debbie would like to know, is there a way to prevent gas colic?
There are ways to minimize the risk of gas colic. I would never go ahead and say you're ever going to, completely remove any risk of it. Making sure that you're kind of staying ahead of the curve. So when you're changing, even just changing your hay, changing your feed, do it gradually because it takes time for those bacteria to change. Some horses are sensitive to vaccinations, to deworming. Using a digestive supplement that may help to stabilize the gut prior to kind of having those insults on the horse. Those kinds of things. Feeding less high sugar feeds, making sure horses have plenty of access to forage. Everything we can do to go back to the very first slide and mimic grazing behavior, mimic the natural behavior for horses, decreasing stress, everything like that.
Great, thank you. And Linda would like to know, does alfalfa make a horse hot with too much protein?
Great question. Everything that you've heard about protein making a horse hot, giving them gastric ulcers, causing developmental orthopedic disease in foals, it's all wrong, completely wrong. Protein is an extremely poor energy source. Yes, protein can be turned into energy, but in order to turn protein into energy, you use energy. So you make some, but you use some, so you come out neutral. The primary time that an animal or a person will use protein as an energy source is if they're starving. So they used up all of their fat stores, they've used up all of their muscle glycogen, and now they're going to start literally utilizing their muscles to survive. They go into a catabolic state and they're breaking down their own muscles to survive. Alfalfa, if you fed your horse alfalfa and he bucked you off, it's because it is higher in calories, energy. It has nothing to do with the protein content.
Okay, and Jessica would like to know, for the cribbers and wood chewers, you recommended to give more hay with more stems. If they don't stop the issues after the change with hay, do you think that would be a behavior issue?
It could be a behavior issue. So try the hay, try a digestive aid type, probiotic, prebiotic supplement, and then it may be a behavioral issue, and you may then have to use some kind of mechanical cover, whether it be some mesh on the wood or paint the wood, to even further deter them.
All right, and Melissa would like to know, I have heard that feeding a lot of alfalfa to geldings can cause kidney problems.
Geldings are no different than mares, and again it goes back to there is very good quality protein in alfalfa and good and high amounts of calcium, so it's not to be afraid of those, but it's just making sure that the horse, when consuming large quantities of alfalfa, you really need to make sure that they're drinking plenty of water. So if I have a lot of clients that they feed 100% alfalfa, their horses don't get a grass hay, they get 100% alfalfa, and that in those cases I always recommend that they actually put some salt on the feed, really just to force the issue of water intake.
Okay, and we have time for one more quick question from Joni. Is it critical to feed grain to a horse at the exact same time every feeding?
Horses are routine, and I would say it's advisable because they get into a routine. They know when you're coming. And if you typically feed them at 7 a.m. every morning, and then on the weekend you go out at 10 a.m. because you want to sleep in, they don't care that it's the weekend, and it will stress them out. And so you'll increase their stress level, hence by increasing, their risk for ulcers. So yes, I would prefer that you fed the horses at the same time every day.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cubit, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We really appreciate your time and interest in wanting to learn more about nutrition for your animals. Before we wrap up, we'll go ahead and announce our winner of the free product coupons right now. And the winner is, please forgive me if I butcher your name, but Bonnie Beauregard. You are the winner, so congratulations, Bonnie. We will go ahead and email you to get some mailing information so we can send out your coupons to you. If you have any other questions that weren't answered during today's presentation, I know we got a lot of great questions in, please don't hesitate to contact Standlee's Customer Relations team. The phone number and email are available right here on this final slide. When you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and it would be very appreciated if you could complete that for us. Your feedback will really help us create better webinars for you and help us to identify some great topics for future webinars that we will be hosting later on this year. You'll also receive a follow-up email within about 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar if you'd like to go back and reference it. The recording should be available for about a week following today's webinar. So on behalf of Standlee Premium Western Forage and Dr. Cubit, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week.